Welcome to the U.S. Imperialism. We're going to be looking at Chapter 20 here, and we're going to be looking at basically this time period of the Gilded Age where we're going to see a rise of U.S. foreign diplomacy and imperialism taking sort of land. Remember, the American West has sort of been conquered, and so now America is now looking for another place. So here we go. So some of the reasons for imperialism, obviously for the economic factors, the Gilded Age, basically for America to sell our goods abroad. We're going to see several of our senators pushing to also increase our market in other countries. Obviously, we have nationalist factors, just basically making our country larger by expanding our country makes it much more powerful on the global stage. Military factors, the need for more naval bases across the board. Of course, if we need to have a merchant fleet, we need to protect those fleets as well. So obviously new naval bases are going to be key. And of course, the humanitarian factors pushing this Anglo-Saxon ideology and health as well. So obviously the biggest thing is that this was happening with America had already expanded. We had expanded all the way to the Pacific Ocean, and now we are having this new manifest destiny abroad. So early imperial action, basically before America got really involved in imperialism in the Gilded Age, two big moments. One was the opening of Japan. Japan was opened up in 1852 through the work of Matthew Perry. Again, America went to Japan to open it up to have a trading partner. They're going to use gunboat diplomacy for this, basically forcing the Japanese to open up with the threat of military naval takeover if not. So a trade agreement was reached, and America and Japan became trading partners from there on out. You also had the purchase of Alaska during basically the Reconstruction period. In 1867, William Seward will buy Alaska from Russia for $7.2 million. It was seen as a joke back then, a complete mistake. That's why it says Seward's folly, which means like Seward's mistake. It was also dubbed Seward's icebox at that time. But again, Alaska was seen as just sort of like a wasteland, nothing really valuable there. Again, Seward's big reason was to get Russia off the American continent, the North American continent. They didn't want Russia to become any type of player within North America, so the thought was to basically buy out their fishing and fur trapping, cities and forts, and their land they had claimed for this small amount. Again, it was more about getting Russia off the North American continent than actually buying Alaska for America. But obviously, as we know, Alaska became extremely valuable in the 1890s with their gold finding. And then obviously with oil being found in tourism, Alaska is an extremely important economic state for America today. So this new manifest destiny was going to be basically happening in the latter part of the 1800s. With the frontier now closed and America really strong in our economic markets, we needed to find new markets for those goods we are producing. And we need to find more land and more resources to sort of fuel this spirit of American ideology. Albert Beveridge said this really nicely. He said basically, we are raising more than we consume. Today we are making more than we can use. Therefore, we must find new markets for our produce, new occupation for our capital, and new work for our labor. So again, really pushing the reason why we're imperializing was to gain capital and gain market ability to basically trade more. You had Henry Cabot Lodge, who was saying that we must not fall out of the line of march. So since Europe and European continents and countries are basically imperializing Asia and Africa, we must keep up the pace. We must also endeavor in imperialism for America to be a great international power. And the justification we used for this, very similar as England did, was Anglo-Saxonism. So the whole aspect that the English-speaking nations had a superior culture, ideas, government, and basically we were destined to dominate the planet. He wrote basically that this was a justification of why we can do what we can do. His famous book, Our Country, Its Possible Future and Present Crisis, sort of highlighted those ideologies. And of course, To do this, we have to have a strong navy. One of our naval commanders, Alfred T. Mahan, actually wrote this book about how to set up America to be this strong naval power and also thus for a world power, the influence of sea power upon history. Again, the thought was that a strong navy was crucial to securing foreign markets. And if you're going to have a strong navy, you also have to have bases around the globe to fuel that navy. And this new naval group is going to be called the Great White Fleet. They were going to construct a brand new naval fleet, all steel, and again, with the most modern technology. So America then will have the naval power to exert its imperialistic intentions. It also was going to basically flex its muscles within this Western Hemisphere. They set up the Pan American Conference of different Central and South American countries to basically establish some type of American dominance connection to those areas. Also, we're going to thwart any type of European nations influencing the power regime within North America and South America. Through the Monroe Doctrine, we are going to get involved in a border dispute between Venezuela and a British territory in South America. And we get involved basically saying to England that they better not get involved in any way with Venezuela, which was a democratic nation. If they were going to do so, we would intervene on the behalf of the Venezuelans. So Britain backs down. So America sort of exerts its power and control over the Western Hemisphere there. Again, basically showing the Europeans not to cross the Monroe Doctrine line. Okay, so we're also going to push ourselves into Hawaii, Samoa, basically to get more resources there, but really as a base as well. So again, we're going to basically annex it. There's the Queen of Hawaii, Queen Liliuokalani. And the big main reasons, again, was for resources like sugar and pineapple. We had lots of American investments and business people who had invested in plantations there. But again, really the strategic location of Hawaii and Pearl Harbor made it ideal for a naval coaling port. And the way we're going to do that is basically the expansionists will talk the Marines into aiding in a overthrow of the Queen. Queen Liliuokalani refuses to step down, so we have this bloodless coup, this military takeover of Hawaii. Eventually, we do take the territory. However, though, President Cleveland was not happy about this happening. Again, he had stepped into the White House with the election of 1892, and at the time, we had just taken Hawaii. So he was going to refuse to annex Hawaii until he was eventually out of office. Once McKinley gained office in 1896, therefore he then went forward with the annexation of Hawaii. So basically we have Harrison, who takes Hawaii, Grover Cleveland, who refuses to annex Hawaii, then the new president, McKinley, who will then annex Hawaii right after he becomes president. We are also going to work out an agreement with Germany and England, basically to share control of the Samoan Islands. And in 1899, we'll annex Samoa, again, not so much for their beautiful beaches, but for their really nice natural harbor there that would help us, again, use as a coaling station and protection for our Pacific Fleet. Okay, we have the Spanish-American War that happens in the 1890s, so it really cements America as a global international imperialistic power. What happens first, basically the cause of the war, one big thing is that America was becoming extremely jingoistic, very nationalistic, and the newspapers were catering right to that. Also, America became very expansionistic during this time period, where much of the American populace was also pushing for American expansionism abroad. So the Cuban Revolt was nothing to do with America at the very start. Obviously, the Cuban population was very unhappy with the Spanish treatment. Spain was very brutal with the treatment of Cuban nationals, and the Cubans eventually will sort of rise up and start a revolution. Spain will respond with extreme force. Basically, they send over General Weyler and 100,000 troops to crush the rebellion. And they do massive damage to the Cuban population there. Tens of thousands of Cubans were slaughtered, starved to death, forced into these concentration camps, and literally were, dying, by the thousands each day. Again, America was so concerned with Cuba because it was so close to the Florida coastline there. And here's some pictures of the revolution, some of the horrors that the Spanish were inflicting on the Cubans. And during this time period, of course, we see our yellow press, yellow journalism, where these press, especially Pulitzer and Hearst of the New York World and New York Journal, really pushing that America intervenes into this revolution there. Again, it will continue to intervene, eventually pushing America to war after a explosion on a battleship. And what yellow journalism is sensational reporting. It features bold headlines, and again, very liberal with the stories they would tell. Again, they wouldn't always print lies, but extreme embellishments of truth. Again, lies, yes. Again, those are newspaper owners with Pulitzer and Hearst. And one of Hearst's famous quotes was, "You furnish the pictures and I'll furnish the war." Basically, get me something I can print and I'll get the people to support a war for America. And then we had the Spanish ambassador, basically a letter being intercepted by him and basically leaked to the press, criticizing President McKinley. And this will get Americans enraged about the Spanish. Then in 1898, we have our battleship USS Maine sent to Havana Harbor to basically oversee the protection of American interests there and making sure basically that any Americans are not threatened or hurt in this revolution against the Spanish. In the harbor, the Maine explodes randomly, and over 260 American naval soldiers, sailors, that's the word, did perish. And immediately we didn't know what happened. But what was being pushed to is that, oh my gosh, something happened to the Maine, probably was the act of the Spanish. Maybe it was a bomb, maybe it was a torpedo, maybe it was a mine, who knows. But we were pushing, the American public was getting pushed into potentially thinking the Maine was blown up and damaged by something the Spanish did. The thing was, though, we had no evidence, no proof. And what happened was basically an internal accident had gone off in the boiler. Basically, that's where all the steam is produced to power the engine. And that was right next to the ship's armament magazines, where all the bombs and all the shells were held. So it caused a massive chain reaction explosion that blew up the whole ship. Nothing to do with the Spanish at all. But with yellow journalism, we see that basically these newspapers were pushing for us to think that the Spanish were involved and pushing us to go to war, which it did. It influenced enough, so basically Congress is going to declare war. And so there we have Hearst, we have Pulitzer, both putting the building blocks on war. So we go to war with Spain. The splendid little war, because it only took a few months. We see McKinley proposition push Congress to basically declare war. They did on April 25th, 1898. And right at the very start, when they basically passed the legislation to go to war, they also passed the Teller Amendment. This amendment basically, Congress declares that the U.S. had no intention of taking political control of Cuba, and that once the war was over, they were going to basically give the island to the Cubans to control with their own government. This was basically Americans' promise that we will not go to war to gain territory. Basically, that was the main idea of this Teller Amendment. The war starts, and we go to the Philippines. The Philippines basically was a Spanish territory. We went there because that it was the best shot to have a quick victory against a strategic Spanish location. And we destroyed the Spanish fleet within 7 hours. However, though, the island was still filled with Spanish, so we're going to need the Filipinos' help for gaining the victory in the Philippines over the Spanish. So we promised the Filipinos their freedom if they help with this ousting the Spanish from the island, which they do agree to, and we do oust the Spanish from the island within about a month. And there's our modern navy against the Spanish Armada, which was still in wooden ships. Eventually, we're going to invade Cuba. This is going to be a much difficult area, but we are going to also have very few military men. Again, we're going to be mostly volunteer, called the Rough Riders. Again, we will have some draftees as well, but mostly Rough Riders, mostly volunteer. And again, it's not going to be a very hard-fought war, except the fact that there's a lot of other conditions besides bullets. Only about 400 men will die from Spanish bullets. Over 5,000 men will actually die of either dysentery or tropical diseases like yellow fever and typhoid and stuff like that from these elements. Also in this war, we're going to see a large number of African Americans fighting this war, obviously not receiving really any public credit. And then we see Theodore Roosevelt as a Rough Rider sort of catapulting his political career once he returns home from this war. And he makes this famous charge up San Juan Hill. Again, was this really the scene of him charging up San Juan Hill? Or was it more maybe like this? What we knew, though, is that African Americans were the ones really making the charge up this hill. And again, taking the brunt of the Spanish onslaught as well. Okay, so after this war, we see that basically America emerges as an imperialistic power, basically with the Treaty of Paris taking over. Sorry, I'm going to go back to the slide. With the Treaty of Paris taking over the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. Again, out of those, we'll eventually give Cuba their independence with conditions. Puerto Rico and Guam are still U.S. territories, and the Philippines was given its independence, but not until after World War II. So, basically, America is emerging and growing as a world power. We see basically William McKinley fitting up Uncle Sam in these larger pants with all the territories, with Texas, Puerto Rico, Louisiana Purchase, Alaska, Florida, California, Hawaii, all being stripes. We also see men coming in trying to give Uncle Sam this diet tonic, this anti-expansion policy tonic. And these are these anti-imperialists here. And we see McKinley being the tailor. Here we see McKinley being the waiter, sort of serving up potential meals to Uncle Sam. The Cuba steak and the Puerto Rican pig, the Philippine Islands, and also the sandwich, which is basically the annexation of Hawaii there. There is going to be quite a bit of debate over the Philippines, whether to take them or not. We're very split on this decision. The anti-imperialists will argue that basically America shouldn't take the Philippines because it's heavily populated and that would go against the Constitution. Whole thing about the flag. Basically, does our Constitution follow the flag? We'll get to that in a couple more slides. The pro-imperialists thought that basically the Philippines was such an ideal strategic location that we couldn't not take them. And here's the argument. The Philippines are right there and so close to the Chinese markets. It'd be great to have that territory to sort of use as a base for our merchant ships and also our Navy to protect our shipping lines. This would be an ideal location. And the Anti-Imperialist League were basically, again, claiming that the federal government had no power to acquire territory in this way, to be a permanent colony. And this was the Anti-Imperialist League. But American government is going to push to actually go to a war against the Philippines, and a rebellion starts there. The Filipino rebellion was led by Filipino Emilio Aguinaldo. We sent hundreds of thousands of American troops over there, and actually this war takes about 4 years to conquer the Filipino natives. Again, and we do brutal tactics to do that. We put them into concentration camps. We burn, villages. Murder hundreds of thousands of Filipinos are slaughtered and killed in this conquering of the islands. Again, not all 200,000 were murdered. Again, a lot of them were, done in different ways. Of like a lot of, for example, starvation. Again, we would not directly starve the Filipinos, but again, we make it really hard for them to farm, and they would die of other ailments because of their lack of food. So again, America had their hands about 200,000 Filipino deaths. Very horrible. The justification for this was that basically, if we give them back to Spain, which means if we don't take them over, they're going to fall prey to another European colonization. And that'd be far worse than us governing the Philippines. A reverse cartoon, you see McKinley looking at the Philippine Islands, Lady of Columbia pulling back our own drapes to see, look at how we treat our own African American population in America. How could we be expected to treat the Philippines and the Filipinos any better? And then we see these insular cases, these cases taken to the Supreme Court, revolving around the Filipino question. As how do we handle them? Obviously, we see that the Supreme Court is going to take up this case. The people of the Supreme Court were given the argument basically, does the Constitution follow the flag? Meaning, when our flag goes to other territories, does the Constitution also go to those territories? Meaning that, do the people in those territories have the same constitutional rights as people here in America? The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the imperialists, basically saying that the Filipinos in the Philippines and the Puerto Ricans do not have constitutional rights because they are not true Americans. That just because our flag is there, basically making them colonies, our Constitution does not protect the inhabitants of those islands. And this was going to be a big major issue on this election of 1900. We're going to see a repeat of the same two candidates, McKinley and William Jennings Bryan. McKinley being the pro-imperialist and Bryan being the anti-imperialist. And we'll see McKinley also, to gain support in the big East Coast city of New York, he will put Theodore Roosevelt as his running mate here. And this is really important because he wins. And he does sweep the upper areas. Again, Bryan has a pretty solid South, and he still gets some of those Western states from his populist agendas that he still carried over. And the biggest part about this, you see, the one thing is that we see Bryan saying, chop down the American flag, where we see McKinley trying to put it up. So obviously we're seeing an anti-imperialist in Bryan and a pro-imperialist with the Republicans with McKinley. And we see here again McKinley with Roosevelt as his running mate. And here's all the things we see. So we see McKinley basically when he took over, America was not doing well. We were sort of in a depression. Under McKinley, we're doing well. Under Grover Cleveland, America was not doing very well. We were basically having runs on the bank. With McKinley, we are doing well again economically. People are running to the bank to put in money. Spanish rule in Cuba under Grover Cleveland, and then American rule, obviously we see the Cubans doing much better. Again, it's obviously artificial right there. Okay, so McKinley wins the election, and early on, we basically in 1901, we create this Platt Amendment where we sort of continued to make the promise of the Teller Amendment. The troops were still, 1901, still in Cuba. Because of the Teller Amendment, we had promised to give Cuba their independence. So we withdraw our troops. But with the Platt Amendment, will give us custody over a base, Guantanamo Bay, in Cuba forever. Plus, Cuba is going to basically have to sort of like act as a protectorate, it's called, where America is going to protect that country of Cuba with certain fingers. So Cuba must never sign a treaty with a foreign power, and the U.S. is allowed to intervene in Cuban affairs to preserve independence. So it doesn't really sound horrible, but again, it's America meddling with this foreign nation, which will be important because you think about Cuba and what it is. Eventually, Cuba is going to basically have some issues regarding, regarding their stance on communism or capitalism in the 1950s. And they're going to go with the Russians because of their hugely bad history with America for the previous 50 years. Well, we'll get to that in a later chapter. So they get Guantanamo Bay in Cuba. We also decide by the late term of Wilson to actually annex Puerto Rico to make it a U.S. Possession and not just a colony. So that's going to be something that we do. Obviously, we wanted Puerto Rico for its location in the Caribbean as a naval base, but also for natural resources. Let's see here, there's Puerto Rico right there. Then we see Uncle Sam. We see him sort of trying to teach, obviously, the people of Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Cuba, the Philippines. We see this nice schoolhouse. Of course, we see an African American washing the windows. We see a Native American out there. We see probably a Chinese person right there. And again, so this is sort of an anti-American cartoon, sort of putting down the American ideology of what they're doing. And we see a pro-imperialism on this side. You see American holding up all these countries. Obviously, they need support because of who they are. We've seen Europe and the European countries looking on at our strong being. And we see America bridging the gap between the Philippines and America, very strong there. But we see on the other side the bad parts of what we were doing with imperialism. Obviously, these imperial colonies are taking a toll on America, showing that maybe we shouldn't be doing what we're doing here. We also are going to open the door with China in this time period. So in the late 1800s, we're going to push to trade and open Chinese markets to American manufacturing, and also look for the resources as well. So again, what this cartoon is showing is that basically the European countries had already sort of gained Chinese access. You see Russia, you see Japan, you see Italy, Austria, Germany, Britain, France, all sort of slaying this Chinese market, and America looking on in the background. So we send our ambassador over there, John Hay, to negotiate with the with the Europeans over the Chinese market. And we basically agree to this open door, these spheres of influences, basically where every single country will have a say in the Chinese market. And America is going to be able to basically break these spheres of influences and get into these Chinese markets as well with this open door policy. The Chinese will fight back with the Boxer Rebellion. These Chinese students, young people, the nationalist Boxers will capture several foreign diplomats, but the rebellion will be stopped when not only the U.S. but other European nations will come together to basically fight back the Boxers to open up China again. And then we have the presidencies of Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson. Roosevelt is going to be very imperialistic. He's going to have a very basically bullish on imperialism. His policy is called a big stick policy. Speak softly and carry a big stick, he says. Again, use the strong arm of your Navy as your major negotiable tool. And he'll also have this corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, which basically means is change, where not only is America going to basically control the Western Hemisphere and making sure European nations stay out, they are also going to be the police presence of the Western Hemisphere, getting involved in Western Hemisphere countries like Nicaragua and Haiti and Cuba, as well as keeping European out, but also sort of being more meddlesome within North America, South America, and Central America. One of the big things Roosevelt will push for is also a Panama Canal. The canal had already started to be built by the French. The French were losing huge financial stakes, so they pulled out. And instead of being able to buy it like we did from the French and then build it, the Colombians who owned the Panama territory basically said, no, we want a new contract. So what America did, we actually encouraged a Panamanian revolution over the Colombians. We'll use our strong Navy to go down there and threaten the Colombians. If they don't let Panama basically become its own country, then we'll intervene. And of course, what the Panamanians promised Americans are full control of the canal zone to build the canal, which we do, and actually coming in under budget in 1914. And what this does is cuts off this whole long journey from basically the east coast of the United States all the way down here and up. You can just go cut across right there. So to actually build the canal, what they do, instead of actually going straight across, what boats do will go up and over the canal zone, then back down in a series of something called locks. So they use these basically big locks that go up and over the canal, then back down. So ingenious invention. And of course, what became really good for America is naval ships could now get from one side of the continent to the other very quickly, thus giving us a much faster response from anywhere in the world. We could get through this much faster with our naval ships. And we see Uncle Sam and a woman, and this woman being North and South America, sort of stealing them away. And of course, Roosevelt's going to be using his big stick diplomacy, or this gunboat diplomacy, to intervene and cause his Panamanian Revolution. We see Roosevelt walking around the Western Hemisphere, sort of pushing back any type of European conquest and controlling the natives of the South and Central America. Again, we see Roosevelt using a big stick to control the Western Hemisphere. Also, we see Roosevelt in Asia. He negotiated a peace agreement between the Russians and the Japanese in a war. He also had a gentleman's agreement with the Japanese would restrict Japanese immigration if the U.S. would stop discriminatory laws against Japanese. So basically, America had lots of bad laws against Japanese, and the Japanese didn't like it. So what they basically says that the Japanese would basically help with keeping less Japanese from immigrating to America if America would ease up on those discriminatory laws. Then also we have the Root Takahira Agreement, where Japan and America agree to respect each other's Pacific territories. Now, neither of us are going to basically go after each other in the Pacific. The Taft Agenda was just a little bit different. The Taft Agenda pushed for something called dollar diplomacy, substituting dollars for bullets. Instead of using Roosevelt's weaponry as the main influence or tactical influence to influence another country, Taft was going to use investment. So instead of using a big navy to threaten a country, he was going to use a big bank account to influence a country by basically pushing in billions of dollars in infrastructure and port building and other things to get them to side with American influences. We also, during Taft's time, we had the Lodge Corollary, where basically Japan wanted to buy Baja California. In 1912, the corollary was passed to exclude any non-European powers basically from owning territories in the Western Hemisphere. So it sort of made a push to make sure that Japan or other Asian countries don't push to take any control in the West. And then lastly, we have Woodrow Wilson and his moral diplomacy. Basically, Wilson opposed imperialism, and he was very much against Roosevelt and Taft's foreign policy. So America, and Wilson is going to state that America would respect other nations' democratic rights and actually push for democracies rather than dictatorships. And this is where we get involved in Mexico. In 1914, there was a revolution, civil war in Mexico, and Wilson basically refused to recognize the dictatorship of General Huerta. American Mexicans will clash in Tampico, where a U.S. fleet in Mexico, sailors went ashore and they were arrested. And basically this was, even though the sailors were eventually released, Wilson will respond by basically sending the military to occupy the port city of Veracruz. At this time period also, revolutionary Pancho Villa will not like the fall of Huerta and the military taking power. Vespucio Carranza took power, and Pancho Villa rebelled against this. To gain attention, what he actually does is actually will raid a U.S. town called Columbus, New Mexico, raid and actually killed several U.S. citizens. With this, Wilson will order basically U.S. General Pershing to pursue Villa into Mexico, which does happen and causes tensions to flare. Eventually, this will basically die down with America getting involved in World War I and needing to put its attention onto World War I over Mexico. And that's it for imperialism. Get your notes done, get your study done, and have some questions for Tuesday on this. Please ask. Again, create some questions, and please ask them on Tuesday during class. Have a great night, guys.